Hi, everyone. My name is Michele Dunne. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you very much for joining us for this program on ultimate political authority, the struggle for power in 21st century Egypt. So we're here today to have a discussion with experts, some of whom have authored two very exciting new books on Egypt, Bread and Freedom by Mona El-Ghobashy, and Lumbering State, Restless Society, Egypt in the Modern Era by Nathan Brown, Shimaa Hatab, and Adly. So what we're going to do today is, as I said, we have several of the authors with us plus commentators. So I will mention today our participants. We have with us, just in alphabetical order, Adly, who is assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. He was formerly a non-resident scholar with us at the Carnegie Middle East Center, where his research centered on political economy, development studies, and economic sociology of the Middle East with a focus on Egypt. Nathan Brown, who's a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. Nathan, of course, is a distinguished scholar and author of 6 well-received books on Arab politics. Mona El-Ghobashy is a scholar of the history and sociology of politics in Egypt and the broader Middle East and North Africa. She teaches on democracy, revolutions, and Middle East political history at Liberal Studies in New York University. We also have with us two prominent scholars of Egypt who will comment on the books. Hisham Hellyer is a fellow at Cambridge University, a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, and a non-resident scholar at Carnegie. His research focuses on international relations, security, and belief in the Middle East, the West, and Southeast Asia. And Yasmine Rashidi is an Egyptian writer. She's a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and the author of The Battle for Egypt, Dispatches from the Revolution, and Chronicle of a Last Summer, a novel of Egypt. So what we're going to do is we're first going to have the authors of these books talk to us a little bit about their work. Then I'll invite Yasmine and Hisham to comment on the books, and we'll have a discussion. There will be time for you to submit your questions. You may do so at any time. So you may use the live chat feature in YouTube to submit a question, or tweet at us your question at Carnegie Endow using the hashtag #AskCarnegie. So you can do that at any time. We'll collect the questions as we go along, and we'll have a Q&A portion in which I'll pose those questions to the authors. So I believe that what we're going to do first is to allow Mona El-Ghobashy to give us an overview of her book, Bread and Freedom. I have to say, when I looked at the book, I wasn't sure I could read one more retelling of the Egyptian Revolution, but this one is really compelling, I have to say. It really made the whole period and everything that happened between 2011, 2013, and afterwards come alive, reminded me of so many things that I had forgotten that took place, important things. And I really love the way Mona chose to use slogans, both revolutionary slogans, counter-revolutionary slogans, and so forth, to kind of animate the work as titles of chapters, subtitles, quotes throughout it. It's highly effective. So Mona, I'm going to give you the floor to talk to us about your book. I'm curious about your how you describe what happened in Egypt as a revolutionary situation. And please tell us, the main findings of your book, and also why you chose to take the approach to this highly complex situation that you did.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for everyone who's in the audience this morning. Thanks for Carnegie for hosting this. I'm very excited and honored to be here with the authors of Nathan and Amr and the discussants. Michelle, thanks so much for the introduction. I think it's a perfect summation of what I was trying to do. And let me start with where you also started. What is there more to say about Egypt 2011 to 2014? We all know what happened. Many people have called it a tragedy. Many people have called it a catastrophe. It is so much has been said, and there seems to be not much more that can be said. However, what I wanted to do was to probe a different angle than usually the founding question or the animating question that people always start with when it comes to Egypt, Egypt being the ultimate failure of the Arab Spring. And the governing question is always, what went wrong? What happened? How could something that was so inspiring to the whole world in 2011, how could it end so catastrophically, so tragically? And my point of departure is that what went wrong, though it captures so much of the repression and it captures so many of the missed opportunities, it comes with its own prepackaged answers. If you begin your inquiry by saying what went wrong, it leads to essentially what I call a prosecutorial narrative, a narrative of praise and blame of specific actors. And in order to do that kind of praise and blame in retrospect, you have to redact, take out so many important events and actors in order to get your argument going. So much of the energy of what went wrong stems from taking out a lot of the complicating, what seems to be details or noise. So what I wanted to do is to provide an alternative, bring back some of those very important and long forgotten actors, ephemeral events, and so on, not to provide what is sometimes people say, all the twists and the turns, there are so many. I'm not providing a comprehensive account at all. But what I'm merely trying to do is to bring back some of those very important controversies and debates, because once we bring them back into the picture, as it were, because they've been cropped out to get at what went wrong, blame this actor or that actor, then the picture starts to become a lot more, I hope, a lot clearer, and it becomes more difficult to make easy value judgments in retrospect. So just to give you one example of what I mean by looking back without necessarily redacting all the important events. If I take you back just from the beginning of 2011 with the ouster of Hosni Mubarak after an 18-day mass revolt following Tunisia's example, up to 2014, when it was very clear that the current president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, was going to contest the elections for the army, just a bare bones narrative of what happened is as follows. If we just put bullet points of what happens. Between 2011 and 2014, there were 2 military coups, one in 2011, one in 2013, 5 governments or cabinets, 2 founding elections or elections that were free and fair after a very long, decade-long period of limited or authoritarian elections, 3 constitutional assemblies, 3 constitutional referenda, and countless thousands of mass demonstrations of various sizes throughout the country, not just in Tahrir Square, but throughout the cities, major provincial cities, over a host of issues ranging from civil-military relations, municipal reform, ending or dealing with corruption, police reform and security sector reform, Coptic rights, women's rights, relations between Cairo and the provinces. This is a moment in which it's very rare for us to witness, and I think this is what I was trying to recover with my book. It's very rare for us to witness a country in upheaval re-examining all of its major issues. Not a single issue. I can't think of a single public policy issue that was off the agenda in those 3 years. And that's what makes them both extremely complex, but it also makes it very tempting for analysts to drop out so much of that complexity and to arrive at what I think are emotionally satisfying, blame-worthy accounts blaming the military, accounts blaming the civilian forces. The most common account, and I'm sure that for many of those of you who are in the audience who are familiar with Egypt and lived these events as I did, you know that one of the key takeaway stories about Egypt and the tragedy of Egypt, or what went wrong, is that the civilian factions, the secularists and the Islamists, failed to come up with compromises to put forward a credible, confidence-building democratic transition. And therefore, due to that failure, the military was able to strategically leapfrog and use the revolution to entrench their interests in a way that we have not seen even in the height of military rule in the 1950s and 60s. So I was trying to get away from that by opening up the frame to look at what some of these forgotten events and actors were. And I want to highlight the title of the book. Bread and Freedom, as Michele pointed out, is the slogan, one of the animating slogans, in addition to the people want the fall of the regime, the master slogan from Tunisia in 2011. Each chapter highlights a particular slogan because that slogan embodied controversies and political arguments that were being made by not just the civilian actors or the military or the liberals, but a much broader swath of the population. This was a moment, we could define a revolution as a moment when the masses get politicized. And one of the things that we tend to forget when we make Egypt's revolution about simply three actors, the military, the secularists, and the Islamists, is we put out of the frame so many of the inchoate campaigns, social movements, regional movements, identity-based movements, economic actors such as labor and civil servants. We just completely forget about them, though they were critical for many of the outcomes that we can come up with. So let me give you a brief example so I don't get too detailed, but a brief example of my approach is chapter 4. I want to take you back to the first 6 months of 2012. If you remember, the first 6 months of 2012, there were three major things happening at the very same time. The first democratically elected under universal suffrage parliament was finally seated in January 2012. That parliament, the minute it was seated, it was activated to form the Constituent Assembly to write the Constitution. At the same time that parliament and the Constituent Assembly were being formed and the massive controversy surrounding that, there was also, of course, the first competitive presidential elections between a minimum of 13 contenders. When you look at all of those three issues simultaneously and the way in which the actors were maneuvering from within state institutions such as parliament, from within the Constituent Assembly and the controversy over that, and then, crucially, the entrance into this moment of high conflict, the entrance of not one, but two of Egypt's most important courts, the administrative courts and the constitutional court, each of which handed down a decision in spring 2012, annulling the Constituent Assembly, the first Constituent Assembly, forcing the parliament to go back and compose a different one. And then the bombshell moment at the time, Nathan at the time called it a judicial coup, probably the most significant judicial decision of the whole revolution, and that was the Supreme Constitutional Court's decision dissolving the first elected parliament in June 2012. This is just a very skeletal way in which I wanted to bring back some of these issues so that when we do discuss, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't attribute responsibility, but in order for us to understand who did what, you have to bring back more of a fuller picture rather than these rehearsed and by now, I think, rather spent analyses of, oh, the civilians didn't agree because of X, or that particular person or that particular political party, if they had made a different decision at that particular moment, things would have gone differently. As we know, if you isolate a particular decision or event without taking account of the contextual factors that made a particular actor do one thing over the other, I think, you arrive at emotionally satisfying, oh, that person did this, or that person did that person stole the revolution, or that political party hijacked the revolution. That may be an emotionally satisfying takeaway, but it really evades all of the controversies and all of the political struggles that I tried to reconstruct with this book. I'd be very happy to get into details depending on the audience and the co-panelists' interests about how else we can see these eventful 3 years in Egypt's history. But I'll stop there, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Mona. Yeah, I really, your approach is really highly effective, and maybe we can talk more. We're going to talk now about the other book, but I'm really looking forward to comparing these two works. They don't contradict each other. They don't tell fundamentally different stories, but they take a different approach. And your approach of sort of chronopolitics and the sequence of events and how things happened, creating the outcomes and so forth, I thought was really, really interesting. We're going to turn now to the book Lumbering State and Restless Society by Nathan Brown, Shimaa Hatab, and Amr Adly. And we have Nathan and Amr with us to discuss this book. This is a highly ambitious work. You really look at the broad sweep of Egyptian politics, society, economy, religion, over a pretty long period, and try to explain the factors that have create the Egypt that we see today. And that you have this ongoing theme of sort of the interaction between state and society, which is terrific. I think let's turn to you first, Nathan, to discuss, I guess, maybe more the political aspects of the analysis, as well as the role of religion in society. So, I mean, one of your fundamental things here is authoritarianism, corporatism, and socialism have shaped Egypt, but each of them in turn sort of decayed without resulting in a liberal democratic order. So talk to us, Nathan, about what you see as the most important themes or findings of the book, and then maybe we can discuss the economic side with Amr.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Michele. It's great coming after Mona, because she talked about the challenges of trying to tell a story about 3 years. It was bewildering. You're right, Michele. We set ourselves a more ambitious task. Let's talk about everything in Egypt over the last century or so. And that was hard. Let me just talk a little bit about sort of how we approached it. And it was essentially what I would describe as an act of assembly, right? It was an assembly in an obvious sense, right? There's 3 different authors and we've got to assemble this into a whole. That part actually wasn't so hard. There was an assembly in a second part as well. When I first started studying Egypt back in the 80s, the 1980s of the previous millennium, I just noticed that the way that American academics, the way that Egyptian intellectuals, the way that Egyptian academics and so on, or journalists talked about the country was very, very different. It was almost like they were talking about different places. And actually, I think that's less the case now. The Egyptian Academy and the American Academy interact an awful lot more, use some of the same ideas and arguments. They're not identical. But so assembling a sort of a coherent story there wasn't quite so hard. What was hard was that the country was so complicated. And what we were trying to do was to assemble a story that could explain Egyptian politics, society, and economy. And the theme that we hit on is essentially what you said. In a sense, I think we were telling the same story from different angles. From a political angle, from a social angle, from an economic angle, and I'll leave some of the details, especially on the political economy, to Amr. But essentially, that was a story, Michele, that you just mentioned. That there is an Egyptian state that is this huge presence in society, and that is, in a sense, everywhere you look. And from the minute you're born, from you go to school, housing, almost all aspects of Egyptians' lives somehow pull in the state in some way, shape, or form. But this is not simply a huge presence, it's also one that, in a sense, kind of overreached, I think, attempted to organize a society in a way that proved too ambitious. And when I use the word the state, where the term the state attempted, it's almost like I'm attributing agency to the state. There is a single state. And actually, what we found was on the political side, essentially a regime that was having trouble sometimes operating all the levers at the same time. So that's a lot of the political story of something of a state that is that is authoritarian for the most part, fairly consistently, but in different ways, and exercising or using these levers with different degrees of effectiveness. Socially, it was a society that is actually, we've got the term Restless Society. It is one which has organized itself both inside and outside of the state, and that has evolved various means of essentially putting forward demands, organizations, movements, leaders, and so on. Especially as the state was lumbering and in some ways retreating, especially in the late 20th century. And a similar story in the economy, right? Egypt had the largest state sector of any non-communist state back in the 1960s. If I remember from my doctoral dissertation, John Waterbury, that was what he kept on saying. It's not that way today, but it's not as if there's a liberal economy that has replaced that. So there's a story about politics, economy, society, and yes, and absolutely religion as well. Certainly, this, when Egyptians do anything religious, they often do so through a state structure, whether it's regulating mosques, whether it's an awful lot of education and so on. And yet, this is the religious aspects of Egyptian society are ones where the state is present but not able to micromanage. So that's kind of the story that we're telling, or that's what we had to assemble. And I guess I'll let Amr describe how it was that we actually did that, especially on the economic front.
If I could just jump in here, thank you, Nathan. I'd like you to explain, you have this interesting way of explaining the Egyptian economy as a habitus economy, what it is that makes the Egyptian economy different from other habitus economies elsewhere, and in some ways less successful. You also have a really interesting approach to the role of the military in the economy and the role of the private sector. I would say, among people whose work I read on Egypt, you sort of magnify the role of the private sector in Egypt more than some others. So please, explain to us what you see as the principal economic themes of the book, or political economic themes.
Thanks a lot, Michelle, for having me and for allowing us to present our book in this forum. So I'll try to follow and try to be as brief as the two friends and colleagues could be. So the approach to the Egyptian economy in this particular book, aimed at, on the one hand, providing a reconceptualization of the political economy of Egypt, not just the economy, because the point that we based our analysis on is that the distinction between all three spheres is rather analytical. It's not really in the real world. So the point was to try to focus more on the economy, and especially the different and very variegated economic sphere that evolved in Egypt, with a special focus on the post-Infitah market-making efforts and the emergence of a private sector driven economy in Egypt, rather than consuming most of the discussion in or on state actions, state decisions, state policies on the economy. This is, of course, not to say that the state is not central. It is central. It remains so, and this is what we have tried to emphasize even in the chapters on the economy. But as I was saying, it's a reconceptualization. We have an economy in Egypt with almost 70% of the GDP produced by some private actors. We have a private sector that has had, especially the small and and to a lesser extent, significantly lesser extent, the medium-sized private sector, that had a sustained presence in Egypt since the times before 1952. So going back actually to the classical book by John Waterbury, he on the Egypt of Nasser and Sadat, he actually provides figures, citing others, that in the heydays of Nasserism and state-led development, still around 56% of the GDP in Egypt was produced by the private sector, especially that some of the main sectors like construction and trade remained very much in private hands. And this is something that provides us with a continuity that we could not find in other communist countries, for instance, where the private sector was primarily informal because it was illegal, and where the creation of the private sector or a formal private sector depended almost solely and principally on the mass transfer of state-owned assets into private hands. So in Egypt, there have always been private sources of accumulation. We can talk about, and this is what I tried to bring on as well, how the oil boom of the 1970s was not only part of the story of Infitah and the attempt at market making, but also the moment when very large flows of private incomes and savings in the form of remittances that have become even more central over time were there to like finance consumption, investment decisions, savings, etc. So there is a story about the private sector to tell. And like most of the literature has been interested in discussing the state side of the story. Again, I'm not saying that there is an economy that exists without the state. That is not anywhere in the world, by the way, and especially in a country like Egypt, where the state is still quite a relevant actor, either as a regulator or as an owner of the means of production, or even the informal networks that are extremely decisive in how power frames the economic opportunities that are available, as well as the economic restraints. However, there are many stories that are not told, that are overlooked. Where it's not only the stories of cronies, it's not only the story of state capture, it's not only the story of these. So one of the interesting things that I try to bring in chapter 7, as well as the chapter on religion, how come that many of those affiliated with the Islamists, with the Islamist camp, could establish such an expansive economy like as of the time of Infitah, with networks that were quite national and like transnationalized, with access to capital of their own, and despite state hostility, at least ambivalence, and definitely well, like that, with an interest in keeping things informal, but yet they could develop something. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. Not only when it comes to these, there are certain dynamics that we wish to unearth by telling the story where the state is only part of the story. It's not the story of the state in the economy. It's rather the story of the economy, where the state is definitely a relevant element. That's why it's political economy at the end of the day, but with an element of economic sociology. So this is what we tried to do by the introduction of, or what I tried to do, by the introduction of an economic sociology / anthropology concept that was developed by Pierre Bourdieu, which is habitus. And I have to say, of course, that it was not like as theoretically sophisticated as I hoped it to be. I'm still working on the concept, like hoping that it would become eventually a tool in understanding, like not only the case of Egypt, but many cases where market making was not only formed totally top down, but rather bottom up as well. Especially that there is, again, like two bodies of literature, for instance, that don't talk that much with each other. Like, for instance, the political economy literature, to which I have contributed, by the way, and I'm proud to have done so, on like focusing on cronyism, on the state restraints, on much of the political determinants of economic opportunities, and like in the form of rent seeking and patronage, clientelism, etc. And at the same time, the stress on rampant informality that engulfs something between 40 and 60% of the Egyptian GDP, which indicates a state that is not in control, a state that has rather limited regulatory capacities. Where often private, small or informal private actors are the ones that end up using the state as part of their like a broader mode of embeddedness, if we may use the term. So again, like I think that the whole book really was an attempt at reconceptualizing much of the thought about Egypt. That's why it's like a reflection on how Egypt was addressed and dealt with in Western academia, with a special focus, of course, on the US academia. That's why it's just like really it raises more questions than provides answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amr and Nathan and Mona. I have lots of questions for all the authors, but I do want to turn now to our two commentators who are going to give us their thoughts about the two books to bring out what they found particularly valuable, or maybe what they would like to question in terms of the analysis presented by both of these books. So let's begin with you, Yasmine, Rashidi, and have your thoughts on these two works.
Thank you, Michelle. To start, it's a pleasure to be among sort of thinkers and scholars I've long admired and not known, except for Nathan, who I want to claim as a friend of late. It's fascinating to hear live the voices behind these books, since I think reading is often quite a different experience. I should preface by saying that, and I suppose this is my disclaimer, is that I'm not a scholar and I'm not an expert, nor a political scientist or historian. In this context, I feel really like the laywoman here. And so my comments and response come from the place simply of being a citizen. And for context, I was born and raised in Cairo, and with the exception of maybe 4 cumulative years of fragmented stretches in other places in my lifetime, I've lived my whole life in Egypt, in Cairo, on the same block, in fact, that I was born on. And so I speak really as a citizen who happens to also be a writer. And I read these books as someone who knows of the history, and who also lived Egypt and these events as of 1977 when I was born. And to, for further context, some of these things are touched on in the books. The day of Sadat's assassination, I was at the Egyptian Museum with my parents and my brother. The day of the conscript riots in 1986, I was at school and have a vivid memory of being rushed home early, inexplicably, for what became a long weekend that should have been fun for an 8-year-old, but was very fraught by the anxiety of family. And only years later did I understand what that was about. And on January 25th, 2011, at 9:30 in the morning, I was at Cilantro Cafe in Mohandesin by Mohammed Mahmoud Mosque, some 10 minutes, 15 minutes from Tahrir Square, with 2 friends, Salma Shukrallah and Mohammed Waked. And we were in anticipation of something. There had been plans for protests that day, and I did not recall, as Mona writes and reminds me, that they were scheduled to begin at 2 p.m. All I remember is that we planned to meet at the cafe as early as we could. We hoped something would happen, but as all the authors point out in their books, no one would have known it, and certainly no one would have anticipated the extent of and the enormity of what did happen in the end. There were plainclothes informants everywhere, sitting in this cafe, supposedly, reading the papers, but taking note of everything. And outside, the streets were deserted. It was a national holiday, but there were plainclothes informants everywhere. And there was something going on. At some point, I think close to 10 a.m., we saw one of the cafe doors close. We knew it was our cue to leave. And we instinctively went in the direction of Boulet, across the river. We managed to reach a friend. We ended up joining a small protest. And Mona writes about this, this atmosphere beautifully. We were walking through the streets and chanting for people to join us. There were lots of people looking from balconies and windows. at some point, Muhammad looked back. I'll never forget, he sort of made an estimate of how big this crowd was of ours, and commented that if there were even 5 similar marching protests across just Cairo alone at this moment in time, it would be the biggest demonstration witnessed. Not long later, we turned a corner. The protest was dispersed. Muhammad was grabbed and taken away by security forces, and Salma and I instinctively rushed to Tahrir. And it was clear that when we approached the square, a moment I'll never forget, that this was something else. The crowd was immense. State security was everywhere but retreating, and the smell of tear gas was thick in the air. Obviously, there was so much has diverged since that moment. And what is extraordinary about these 2 books to me is that, as different as they are, not only do they offer, and certainly Mona's case, a vivid, detailed recounting of the events of broadly the past 10 years. In Mona's book, you really live the revolution in extraordinary, very compelling, incredibly evocative, and factual, very considered, in a real time. But in both cases, and in very different ways, you have a very thorough, informed historical backbone. Going much further back, in the case of Lumbering States, briefly even touches on the Ottoman Empire, but also as analysis and comparison with other countries, political theory and studies, in the context, obviously, of other nation states and revolution. What struck me in Lumbering State is that it's broken down in these sections that somehow, and it's a feat, I think, manage on the one hand, and you heard the authors speak, on the one hand, manage to explain very lucidly a very complex reality with the necessary parallel examples. And the fact that this isn't a simple story of 2 players, which everyone touched on, and I think is really important, that, the state itself is severely fragmented or even misaligned in cases, as are the forces of change. Although it's a book to study, there are these moments, I think, where it reads a little bit like almost a detective story. I felt that it's very compellingly written. There's a moment where the authors linger on the term deep state, giving it historical context too, which I think is fascinating and important. And yet they still don't sort of succumb to the general tendency in books or narratives to reduce the state into these 1 or 2 bodies or against actors of change. And I'm going to read like a tiny paragraph from Lumbering States that will give the audience a sense of the type of mood that they set in this book, and I think what makes it special. And again, I'm doing this as the writer in the room rather than the scholar. The story of Egypt, as we tell it, does not begin with one actor, ruler, regime, or state, nor is it shaped by one factor, religion or economics. Instead, it is a story of shifting interaction among them, a series of rulers who have built or remodeled regimes that struggle to control a sprawling apparatus, a state apparatus that has grown into new areas of society and economy, but has been forced in recent decades into a partial retreat. And Egyptian social actors who have organized with varying success and across varying fields, politics, economics, and religion, in different ways to shape the state and its policies. We tell of an Egypt that speaks with many voices, but in which one voice, that of an authoritarian leadership, strives to be louder than the others. I think that last sentence is really extraordinary. I think it says it all. And I do find as a writer that it's extraordinary that the book manages, on the one hand, to illuminate, even in outlining and mapping out, for a general reader, but also for someone who knows quite a lot about Egypt. It sort of seems to be both a book to study, but as a general reader and writer, I feel it's a book for me too. And Mona's book is so different and yet complementary. It's a beautifully written account and analysis, incredibly detailed. There are nuggets of gold everywhere, of the inner workings of the events, and reminders of these critical moments that certainly I'd forgotten and perhaps at times didn't know in such detail. For example, during Morsi's year in office, there's a photo that really struck me on page 196 of President Morsi and the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And it reads, "The real agenda of this meeting was to reclaim foreign relations as the military's reserve domain, putting a stop to Morsi's energetic foreign policy. In the new year, he had undertaken several bold departures from Mubarak-era foreign policy, inaugurating charter flights between Cairo and Tehran, making conciliatory remarks about the disputed Hellyer triangle with Sudan." And it goes on, ending, quote, "In statements to national television after the meeting with SCAF, a diminished, shaken-looking president stood encircled by 24 generals in full uniform. And he spoke second after Defense Minister Abdel Fattah el-Sisi." Mona continues that 2 days later, the Cairo-Tehran flights were cancelled indefinitely, and so on. It's a critical moment, and that she had also access to a certain kind of information. And what it does is it's also a reminder for us that and that has perhaps been forgotten, is in ways Egypt was at its freest in a sense under Morsi. The book brings to the foreground events that have receded from our memories, like Baltim and Hamdin Sabahi, the once presidential candidate and really galvanizing political popular figure. And I have to say that the revolution narrative for me has been exhausted. I've read the story so many times. Obviously, I lived it and was extremely disappointed and broken by it in ways. And it's hard to compel me to read it again, and even more so to be moved by it. And Mona's book really, it swallowed me in. It's so compelling, and it draws you in and makes you both relive and really feel those moments again. And I think what's really critical about the book also is that she repeatedly takes you outside of Cairo and to the governorates, which is such a crucial part of the story that's, I think, very often overlooked. And the complement between the two is that, and I think what they both do extraordinarily, is that they really make you sort of pause and reconsider prisms of perspective around events. And again, this moment of Morsi's rule now, from our vantage point, we had the most liberty in many ways, certainly in terms of media and free speech. I most appreciate, I think, that the books give very measured, even vivid, felt accounts and analysis, which I can't imagine is easy because everyone has stakes. And I think what I'm left with as a writer, I think this is known to people who read on Egypt, as a writer who has been forced to go back and reconsider and revisit and confront narratives that I wrote and published. And these books, what I'm left with is the necessity, I think, for all of us to, not just writers or analysts, but even as citizens, I think, is to take the time to consider what we're perpetuating, the legacies, the history. Somewhere between these two books, I think a lot can be resolved and corrected and taken forward to make sounder, more generative both decisions and conversations moving forward.
Thank you, Yasmine. Yeah, I just want to say a number of the things that you said about these books resonate with me. And I will just say, just in the simplest way, that in both of these books, as different as they are and as different as this kind of the way they structure their analysis is really quite different. But there were so many things that felt right to me, felt resonated with me this is an Egypt I recognize, and this is as you said, being reminded of many things and seeing this more complex picture. So thank you. We're going to turn now to Hisham Hellyer, also author of an important book on the Egyptian revolutionary period, as well as many other works. And so, Hisham, we'd love to hear from you, your reflections on these two works, what you found valuable, as I said, what you might want to challenge or problematize. Your analysis is very welcome.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you to all of the authors. The books, I think, are extremely important to add to all of the literature that already exists on Egypt. I think they provide a number of interesting lessons for us, frankly, but I'll try to get into that for a little bit before we go back to our audience. I agree, by the way, with you, Michelle. The use of slogans in Mona's book. Mona, you used a very particular literary tool, and it is a great one. It is one that I've tried to use in my own work, and I did not do as successfully a job at it as you did. It draws people in because you have to contextualize those slogans. You have to understand what drew people to those slogans, what they mean. What happened around the events where these slogans were being used. And slogans are often connected to very particular events, and they're also connected to particular periods. And to this day, as somebody who was in Egypt throughout the time that you focus on, somebody who's partly Egyptian himself, but also very much linked with trying to explain these events to particularly Western audiences, I kept getting reminded about certain slogans over the last decade, and what they actually signified, and what they meant. And again, to this day, people will make comments, right, where you can't imagine what they're referring to unless you lived those particular years. Something as simple as saying Eid Saeed instead of Eid Mubarak. Only Egyptians will get why that becomes important. But it's that sort of literary tool that you use that I really appreciate. Now, Egypt is I don't want to prolong this because I think we have time to get into questions with people, but Egypt is a very difficult subject to get into, particularly when it comes to the period of 2011 to 2014. And on the one hand, one would think that because it was all very well documented at the time, because of social media, because of Twitter, because of Facebook, because of so much media that was interested in Egypt at the time, that it would be very easy for people to agree on what happened. Right? And the significance of what happened in certain places at certain times. Are we going to be talking about history in a very nebulous sort of fashion? No, we shouldn't have to do that. We should be able to simply agree on the facts because the facts are well known. But of course, that's not the case at all, because actually narratives are not simply about facts on their own. They're about how they're interpreted. It's about how they're deliberately or purposefully misinterpreted in order to fashion a narrative and a story. And when I read these books, I looked at them as I always do, someone who's very aware of his own background, living through those events myself, particularly when we're talking about Mona's book, but also somebody who spent a lot of time in Egypt over my lifetime, which stretches more into Nathan Amr's books. And I remember in 2016 being very dissatisfied how we were recollecting very recent events, and how this was being done, and so soon after the events had actually taken place. and Michele mentioned my own book on this. I wrote my own book partly out of frustration at this, where so many things that happened so recently, and history being rewritten right in front of us, months in some cases after this had taken place. There was one event that I remembered very clearly. A very significant revolutionary figure, Sheikh Ahmed Affat, who was an Azhari scholar and worked at Dar al-Ifta al-Masriya, the official sort of fatwa giving body of Egypt. And he had been involved in the protests in 2011. At the beginning of 2011, he had also been involved in them for many months thereafter. And he was killed while he was protesting and involved in a particular clash that took place near Tahrir, but not at Tahrir itself. And I remember at the time there wasn't the single piece of doubt as to how he had been killed. It had been in at the when the crackdown had taken place that particular evening. There were people who thought that he had been targeted specifically, but he wasn't in his Azhari garb. But nobody doubted that he had been killed by the security services as they cracked down on that particular protest. And I remember coming back from Tahrir Square in, I think it was late summer 2013, and hearing on the radio a radio host saying, "We finally know who killed Ahmed Affat. It was the Muslim Brotherhood." I said, when did we finally know that? But it was just that process of reinventing and rewriting history that was quite extraordinary. And this is part of why it's difficult, I think, to write about Egypt and to really get into the weeds of this. And I remember when I went through my own writings between 2011 and 2014 in order to write my book, I found myself, questioning certain nuances that I might have left out later on, or that I had included and forgotten about. And I'm the same person writing, so it becomes very easy for people to do that, more generally speaking, I think. So it's refreshing to see a book like Mona's, because she recognizes that this kind of phenomenon exists, and if nothing else, that's in her mind as she tries to trace the story. And she says in the book, quote, "In this book, I do not offer yet another dramatic exposition, nor my own distribution of praise and blame, preferring to steer clear of the inquisitorial mode of historiography that Mark Bloch warned against," end quote. And I think that's important. I will say there's definitely a place for that kind of writing. And certainly when we get into political analysis and the study of history, it's very difficult to avoid. But what has become so intriguing to me to see when it does come to Egypt, it's become so varied and so wide in terms of that kind of drawback, and so soon after the events, indeed, very, very soon. At a time, again, when everything's online, everything has been, documented probably multiple times over. So, and of course, even when we insist that we do not engage in that kind of distribution and blame, we subtly do that. We do it in terms of how we categorize, how we describe different groups, how we label different states, and so on. And it's important to recognize that even when we try to account for it, we're still likely to be guilty of it. There's something that connects the two books in terms of a comment that I had as I was reading through them, which isn't necessarily a critique, but is, perhaps for further work in the future, the word secular. So the word secular comes into Mona's book quite a lot. I saw less of it in Amr and Nathan's work, where they focus more on the divide between Islamist and non-Islamist, which I think is important because it distinguishes in a different sort of way. And there's an explanation that one can draw implicitly about secular in the first book, but I would have liked to see more contextualization discussions on it. As I said, it's implicit, but I think that more explicit explanations in that regard would have been useful in reminding people about the different layers between different commitments and how religion is used or not used in Egyptian society would have been quite useful. Now, when it comes to something else about Mona's book that I really appreciated, this and this is another quote of hers. This book has taken uncertainty, which nearly every study on Egypt's uprising mentions in passing, and placed it at the center of analysis as its foundational framework, taking seriously what political interaction looks like in the midst of so many intersecting, opaque, and confounding circumstances, end quote. And this is the core, I think, of what is generally so lacking on so many works on Egypt, where we see a lot of certainty about how inevitable certain situations were, when really there was a huge amount of flux. And at particular points, things could have gone a very different way if the forces that had at least some power, if not all, had chosen differently. So in that regard, I look forward to more, not less work that does not take quite such a deterministic kind of viewpoint where things were just clearly and certainly A and B, and more work that shows the genuine flux that was continuing, particularly until 2014. Now, when it comes to the second book that I've got here, Lumbering State, Restless Society in Egypt in Modern Era, I found it particularly satisfying and profoundly so to see the comparative work that came into this, particularly bringing in the economic aspects. And as they note in the work, we work to show how authoritarianism, corporatism, and socialism came to shape Egyptian politics, society, and economy, and how they have decayed without resulting in a liberal democratic order. And this again shows the flux, which I think is the most important part of this. I'm a student of political economy, and I think that the economic aspect of many of these events is left sorely understudied. And that engagement between economic concerns and other things is really important. We see discussions here about religion and how that impacts on the economy, the military and how that impacts on the economy, even as, just as Amr pointed out in his opening comments, imagining an economy without the state in Egypt is not possible. But there's a lot of flux, again, in terms of how the state creates that or stimulates that in negative ways in different points in its history. And I liked how Part 1 analyzes the state and its engagement. It takes a more historical view more than others do, dating back to the 19th century, because this, again, I think is a part of the story that is often left out, that the very structure of the Egyptian state is very much indebted to how the colonial era defines the structures, right? People talk a lot about the protest law that exists in Egypt today, and they seem to miss that protest law has a historical legacy in Egypt that goes back to the colonial era, that it was made, and the founding sort of principles of protest law within Egypt is very much about the colonial era. And there are many things like that within the Egyptian system, where the colonial legacy still continues to play a magnificent and very negative but huge role in how the structure of the state continues to unfold, and frankly to be locked as well. So when people talk about reform and trying to make things better, I wonder if they realize that the very basic bedrock, the building blocks of this particular system is very much not a few decades old, but much further back than that. That colonial heritage and the impact of it, I think, is very important. And I, again, appreciate very much that, Part 2 gets into civil society in different ways, which, again, has been looked at perhaps a little bit more, but not as much as one might hope, which I think, again, is something that's very, very relevant for us that study Egypt. So I then come to what am I personally left with? And as somebody who continues to write about this region, but also looks at Egypt very closely and teaches to students, I think that it's about how we teach this history of not just the past decade, but the past 100 years to our students, to our readers, how we engage in the public arena more generally when we try to explain how these events unfolded and what lessons we can draw from that period going forward, and pass all of that on to people in the next generation. And it sounds strange to say that. It sounds strange to talk about the next generation when, again, these events didn't happen an eon ago or 25 years ago, only 10 years ago in some of these cases, right? But it is really a new generation, particularly when we're talking about the region that we're engaging with. Right? This is a very young country. It's a very young region. The average age of an Egyptian today is about 23 years old. Around 70%, I think, of the population of Egypt is under the age of 30. So you have this incredible generational shift that moves very, very quickly, where a majority of the population would not have been politically conscious during the time that these events that happened only 10 years ago took place. So there's a lot of work that is to be done, and I'm grateful that we have books like these to be able to draw lessons from.
Thank you, Hisham. I'd like to remind our audience that we're now open for questions, discussion. To ask a question, you may use the live chat feature in YouTube, or you can tweet your question at us at Carnegie Endow using the hashtag Ask Carnegie, and then we'll see that those questions get answered. As I'm listening to all of you, I'm thinking it's really interesting. You've raised, Hisham, this question of kind of narrative and what has gone on. And one thing that I really appreciated about these two books is they tried to look objectively at the past and establish a narrative, because as you say, the narrative is so contested. It's contested and highly politicized and used by different parties for different purposes. What happened, what really happened in 2011? Was it wonderful, or was it a disaster? What happened in 2013, and so forth. And I'm curious, I'd like to actually offer this to you, Hisham, and any of the other panelists who are interested. To what extent do you see Egyptians now as ready to reassess what happened, ready for a more objective analysis of what has happened in the country politically and economically in the last 10 years? Because it and your books are somewhat different, especially when we're looking at the 2011-2013 period. I mean, as I recall from Ahmed and Nathan's book, it seems to me that you discuss what happened in 2011 and 2013 a bit as the outgrowth of large trends that developed over decades, right? The fragmentation of civil society, the Islamist, non-Islamist divide, the military as an arbiter within the country. You sort of see these big trends as having shaped what happened. Mona, I don't think you deny the importance of trends, but you are looking a little more, as I said earlier, at chronopolitics and sort of the sequencing of events, the sequence of events, how things happened, sort of how the chips fell, so to speak, in a certain way and shaped events. So I'm curious, if any of the panelists would like to reflect on this question of different ways of looking at the last 10 years, as well as if any of you have thoughts about how Egyptians, and this could be Egyptian scholars, journalists, intellectuals, etc., nowadays, whether they're looking at things in a different way, and whether you think they're ready for a broader or objective, is it even possible, to establish one or more narratives that are kind of commonly accepted of, what has happened in the last decade and why? Are there any of you who would like to comment on this?
Sure. I'll go first. I think the overarching answer to that question is that, at least in my opinion, I think Egyptians are exhausted. If I can be really frank, I think that there's been so much that has happened over the past decade, that for people to sort of stand back and try to think about and analyze afresh what happened a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, presupposes that they're in sort of a state where things are stable for them personally, and that things aren't moving very quickly. And for many people, they still are moving quite quickly. And within Egypt, as I'm sure all of you know, the economic situation is still quite difficult for the vast majority of people. That's simply a nature of what's going on. We've had the COVID-19 pandemic hitting the entirety of this planet, which has, pushed forward certain other things as well. So ready, I don't know, because I think that, again, you also have these different generations that came up. I remember seeing somebody in 2016, just literally 2016. This was only a few years later, and she had been an activist organizer between 2011 and 2013. And she was talking to me about two sets of things. One, the trauma that she had and that she knew from her generation. Okay, and she used these words very particularly, that her generation of activists during that time. And then she said that they were unable. This older quote unquote generation was unable to really affect how discussions were going on with the younger generation. It's like, what do you mean younger generation? You're talking about 3 years ago. It said, oh, no, these kids are different. These kids are completely different because they didn't live those 2.5 years or whatever between 2011 and 2013. They didn't live that period as politically conscious adults, and they're completely different from us. So a generational divide that isn't about 20 years or 25 years, but it's really about a year or two. So you take that and you also, add to it, in my opinion, just things happening regionally speaking, economically speaking. There was the float of the pound back in 2016 that had huge repercussions. I happen to think that it was something that was inevitable in many ways, but it certainly had huge repercussions over what happened. Population growth, which means even more of a pull on the country's infrastructure and the provision for medical as well as educational provision, etc. So I think Egyptians are just very, very tired, and they're I don't think they're ready to do much beyond just trying to keep up.
Can I jump in and piggyback off of what Hisham? And first, I just can't express my gratitude to the discussants. It is the most gratifying thing to be read so closely. That is, it's just an indescribable feeling. So Hisham and Yasmine, thank you so much for taking the time. And I want to piggyback off of what Hisham said. He said two things that I think are crucial and represent what I was trying to do better than my own words. The huge amount of flux. Something that I was trying to do with this is to capture this. The social sciences are very ambiguous about chronopolitics. They don't trust it. They think that flux is ephemeral. That's always been, ever since I was an undergraduate, it's been my lifelong struggle with the social sciences, how to get them to take interactionist sociology, like Amr put it, seriously. And now we are actually at a moment that is much more auspicious for interactionism rather than structuralism, in the sense that I think there's now more space, even within the Anglo-American Academy, to consider flux as a real time of, or a moment of analysis. And it's not just an ephemeral thing that ultimately settles into deep structures, as if, for instance, Egypt is fated to have military rule ever since 1952. I think there's more recognition and perhaps openness to the idea of how can we analyze flux. The point, Michele, that you bring up, I think about this almost every day. The way in which Egyptians are both traumatized, exhausted, as Hisham put it, and also repressed from having a real discussion about what these events mean. Partly because the events themselves, as all of us now keep repeating, they happened so quickly, as Yasmine put it really beautifully. The inner workings of the events were so dense that even those of us who thought we were paying attention are constantly surprised when we're recalled into what's happening. And by the way, we haven't barely skimmed the surface of what really happened. And so I just wanted to point out that it's also by force that there is a repressive aspect preventing many subcultures in Egypt from having the dialogues that need to be had and to begin to sort out some of these contested, highly contested, and by the way, we're never going to get to a consensus about what happened. I don't think that's a bad thing. What I think is extremely destructive is that there is no forum, even in the exile communities, either in Turkey or the exile communities in London or even in New York. There is just not the infrastructure yet for people to have calm conversations about why we see things so differently and why that might not be a bad thing. And this is a very big problem in Egypt's history, the constant erasure of our history. And the beautiful quote that Yasmine read from Nathan and Amr's book, the state always wanting to be the loudest voice and to erase other voices because they don't have the same kind of legitimacy. I must say, I'm extremely chagrined that that continues to be the case.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on this point?
Sure.
Yeah. Oh, Yasmine,
No,
please go ahead.
No, just a tiny. I mean, I echoing the others, is I feel that there was this moment, this explosive and very super divisive, dividing moment in 2013 that carried on for, and then it was almost like there was a silence, and I don't feel that we've come out of that silence. In that. I mean, it's extraordinary that these books written it hasn't been that many years since all this happened, are as felt as they are. They're also very measured and very meticulous in giving all these different facets of a structure and of events. And I don't at all feel we're ready. I mean, as someone who lives the day-to-day in Cairo, I'm not there right now, but I don't feel that we're at all ready to have these conversations. And I do wonder what it will take. And Hisham raised the next generation, and I feel that in them, I think there maybe is a different kind of hope in that. I have a 10-year-old cousin who. I remember when Mubarak died, and I'm like, oh, and she said, what? I said, Mubarak died, and I had to then explain to her Mubarak, the revolution, and it struck me. And this is sort of the future, and I feel that they're very, very different from us. And I think these two books together, I think, are such a good guidepost moving forward for conversation.
Great. Maybe let's, Nathan, I'd like to turn to you because we're talking a little bit about these two books, and I'm wondering if you have some comparative observations you'd like to make about these two works and how they look at events and developments and structures in Egypt in different ways.
Yeah. I'm attached to both books. I love Mona's book. I never love anything I've written after I've written it, but I only wrote parts of this, so I love the parts I didn't write of the Lumbering State book. But I'm struck by two things from this discussion, and from Yasmine's and Hisham's comment. I think we're wrestling with similar problems, but we approach them differently. Not in terms. I mean, basically, we approach them differently in terms of tone. So we're wrestling with the problem. Everything is related to everything else. So Amr starts talking about political economy, and then he bumps into Islamists. I mean, this is, somebody's. The state of somebody's soul doesn't seem to factor into an economic analysis. But for Amr, when he does economy, he's not just doing political economy, as he insisted. He's doing social economy. Social connections and social movements become important. You can't understand. You can't understand Egyptian economy without understanding Egyptian society. Let me just put in a plug here for Amr's award-winning other book, Cleft Capitalism, which sort of explores this in much greater detail. And so everything's related to everything else. And so how do you make sense out of it? And the second thing, actually, I remember in Mona's remarks, she was saying, you can't point to this actor and that event, or this actor say it was their fault or if they had done things differently. On the other hand, you can't tell this story without telling what was going on and what various actors were doing. You can't simply tell a univocal story of Egypt. So you have to listen to these various voices, but you can't let any one of them dominate or judge them. And those are the problems that we both wrestle with. Mona, I think, does this by first, it's more temporally defined. It's a short period, but you really emphasize contingency and uncertainty. And so in order to understand what was going on, you don't focus on this was a story of failed revolution, this was a story of this, or this was a story of that. What the story was about was changing from day to day and from actor to actor. And the second book, our book, I think we're all political scientists and we're trained to explain outcomes, right? That's what we do. Mona's a political scientist too, but she's a more rebellious one, right? She's inspiring me to be a rebel in a way that I'll mention in a second. But so what we're trying to do is to sort of we are trying to understand various events, but we're trying to come up with some sort of overall framing argument. This is the trend. And so the tone is very, very different. Let me go back to the thing about explaining outcomes. I like our book. I like our book as it is, but Mona's partly persuaded me. I'm actually starting a project now where I've actually started saying, wait a second, let's toss out outcomes. Politics doesn't end. Michele, your question, how do Egyptians talk about this today? This story isn't over. It may be that specific events are in the past, but Hisham talked about historical memory and generations, and Yasmine did as well. If we want to understand politics, Mona's persuading me that we have to understand it not simply subjectively from different angles, but understanding politics as something that doesn't produce a specific outcome as if history ends with, June 30th or July 3rd, 2013. And that's something that I'm sort of trying to take on board in my future work. Just one final comment about tone. If you found Yasmine's personalization of memory and so on of the account, very powerful. If you love listening to Yasmine just now, you'll love Mona's book, right? That's kind of the tone. You won't find that so much in our book. Hisham was personal, right? But he was also trying to step back and be analytical. Our tone is probably a little bit more like Hisham's. Mona's is a little bit like Yasmine. Both of them have serious arguments to make. But I really want to thank the discussants for either consciously or unconsciously giving us some sampling of the various ways that scholars can kind of approach a complicated and actually pretty emotionally difficult subject like this.
If I may, I'd like to bring Amr into the discussion a little bit. I'd like to return to the economic side of this. I mean, Amr, you are, working on and developing the Bourdieu, concept here, applying to Egypt of the habitus economy and so forth. But I thought you had some really interesting things to say in the book, and maybe you can bring them out here about this, how the Egyptian market is sort of rooted in the society, but also, how it affects politics and why it is that, I think a lot of us look at the Egyptian economy and you can kind of, it's hard to understand sometimes how it's, speaking of lumbering, we speak of the lumbering state, where the Egyptian economy sort of lumbers along too. And in some ways it's not as successful as other habitus economies. You have some interesting comparisons with other countries or regions of the world, and yet it sort of keeps going, and it's more diverse and successful, at least for some Egyptians. So maybe you could bring those aspects out a little bit more for us.
So thanks. Thanks a lot, Hisham and Yasmine, for reading the book and offering comments. You could see things that I couldn't quite see, even in the part that I wrote. So thanks, Michele, for the question. Well, the point is that I think, as Hisham was saying, there is an element of what we might call flux, what I refer to as like bottom-up factors that definitely have some implications and have had implications for the evolution of Egypt's politics as well as society more generally. And this is the part where sociology might help a bit. Not in overlooking, as I was saying, what role the state might play, but the other way around, because as like the overall framing that it was like mainly the work by Nathan, and this was like the book was his idea, like expressing also the agency of many different societal actors and trying to understand like the thing in an interactionist manner, not necessarily in a like a game theory sense, but trying to understand processes. And that's why I actually tend to see that both books do share a lot, not only the topic, like they do share some methodological and conceptual issues that they take with not only the scholarship on Egypt, but more generally like the social and political sciences and how they treat, of course, the topic that we are interested in. So to start with, the study of the private sector is not only about how these firms have been there, how they evolved, etc., but there is like a story to tell about the like the big businesses themselves, not only the part where they become political actors or that they become relevant in policy making, because some of them, by the way, are never politically active in an explicit manner. How they adapt to uncertainties, not only created by the state, but created also by the fact that Egypt is a developing economy with chronic macroeconomic instability. So all of these eventually add up into shaping state-society relations. And this is something that has been missing, by the way, from political science. Ironically, you have rather very interesting anthropology stuff that was written, as well as economic and statistical stuff about the topic of informality, for instance. But informality is, above all, a way of analyzing as well as describing state-society relations. It has to do with the state regulation. It also has to do with how these social actors come to accumulate capital, engage in doing business, transacting different values that are quite sizable. It's not on the margin. As a matter of fact, the formal private sector is the one that is marginal, by the way. If we take the figures, it is the one that stands for something less than 20% of the total employment. It's something that stands for overall around 30%, if not even less, of what we refer to as the private sector. So I think that again, like sociology is not there to displace like a more mainstream political science. It's just like there that it can add a lot in understanding power, not only within the state apparatus, not only without assuming that the state is a monolith or anthropomorphizing the state, but trying to understand in a very interactivist or interactionist manner how power is really exercised, how it is practiced between different agents responding to various restraints. And here I think that both books are really complementary to a great extent, and that we are trying to bring in the same thing. I'm not saying that myself and Nathan are as rebellious as Mona is. We are definitely less rebellious, but I think that we at least like have the same critique to give, and the hope for a research agenda that looks at different things and looks at them differently. I hope this is like relevant to the question that you raised.
Thank you, Amr. Yeah, and I mean, I think you're right. It is certainly important to look at. Egypt is a dynamic place. Things are still happening. Interactions between these different factors are still going on. History has not concluded. Our program, however, has almost concluded. We have just a few minutes left, and I wanted to give each of the panelists a moment for a concluding thought, either something that you wanted to say during the panel that you didn't get a chance to, or a reaction to something someone else said, or maybe a new thought. I mean, Nathan already gave us a new thought about his ongoing work on Egypt and how it might be shaped by the works that we've discussed today and the discussion we've had today. So I think what we will perhaps do is go in a reverse order, if that's okay. And I'll go to Hisham Hellyer first for your concluding thought. And these have to be very short. We only have a few minutes left.
Thank you, Michelle. So my concluding thought is that I hope that these aren't going to be the last two books that we read about Egypt on this period in the coming phase. Things are still very much, I think, in flux, not only in Egypt, but in the region more generally speaking. I think that there's still a lot that needs to be done in order to understand how we got here, where we're going, how to minimize damage going forward. Maybe I've become a little bit more cynical over the years, but the question of limiting damage and minimizing bad things happening perhaps ought to take precedence over trying to get good things going. Again, it's a low bar, but it's one that I prefer to find as at least realistic and pragmatic. So I hope that there'll be more. And I'm sure that, over the coming months, we're going to see different discussions that arise as a result of engagement with works like these. And I look forward to it. So if no other reason than that for bringing Egypt into a public conversation, I thank the authors again.
Yasmine.
Very quick comment back, I think, to the question of are we ready to have a different kind of perhaps more generative conversation. I think part of the reason perhaps why we're also not is that going back to sort of what Mona has done and then to Nathan's comment is that the situation is ongoing. And I think part of what makes it continued, why it continues to be fraught in a sense is an economic reality, and economic divides and fragmentation that make it very difficult for people to be to find a common ground. And given the ongoingness, perhaps there will be volume to each of these books. I would gladly read.
Thanks. Amr, your turn. You're still muted, Amr.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I discovered so. It's quite noisy down here in Cairo. Yes. No. I just wanted to thank you really for this, for the interest in the book and for allowing this forum. It's always nice to get back and to have something to do with the Carnegie, and it's also great to have met people that I know that I like from their work and their writings. Mona and Yasmine, but finally to meet in person.
Thanks, Nathan.
I will certainly add my gratitude to Amr, but also want to respond very briefly. Yasmine's challenge. I think you were the one who said, volume 2, and Hisham kind of continue working. This is a problem. And it's a problem on many different levels. Social science research is very difficult to conduct. Travel to Egypt for non-Egyptians is iffy, especially if they want to do this kind of work. But there's other things as well. And one of the things is something that both Hisham and Yasmine mentioned, and I think Mona as well. These are conversations, my impression is, that are just a little bit more difficult for Egyptians than they used to be. When you went into Egypt during the period that Mona's writing about, you were just inundated with words. And now sometimes awkward silences in the conversations that I've eavesdropped, or people who tiptoe around subjects. So that's a problem, but there's an even bigger problem as well. There were all kinds of surprises in 2011 and 2012 and 2013. But what people's basic orientations were, kind of the demands and the issues, those weren't a surprise. If you were paying attention to Egyptian press, to Egyptian discussions, various media over the previous 10 years, there was lots of discussion. There's a public silence now. There is a public silence. And reading Egypt today from abroad reminds me like reading it of the 1960s. There's official voices, and that's it. And that makes the job of people like me much more difficult. So volume 2 might be very, very short.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for reminding us. Actually, that I think that makes these two books, even more precious as a resource, because it is much more difficult to do this kind of work than it used to be, and there are not as many good works being produced on Egypt as there used to be. Mona, last word to you.
Just to echo Nathan, we haven't even begun to explore the implications of the public silencing for ethnographic and fieldwork-based research. I should note that my book is done purely, and both as a necessity, but also as a methodological choice, it's a non-interview based book, because by the time I started writing it, it was no longer possible to talk to people. Most of them were either in prison, in exile, or deceased. And so in contemplating how we're supposed to understand Egyptian politics in the next 10 years, we have to contend with the reality that we may have to resort to archival-based work and hopefully make the best of it. I will want to plug also a book that I'm highly anticipating by the former human rights lawyer and current sociologist Atif Said, who's going to be producing a book that's the first ethnography of the revolution, and it takes in chronopolitics, it takes in so many of the themes that we are discussing today, and I think does so even more evocatively. So hopefully that will come out soon.
Thank you, Mona. I want to congratulate the book authors and thank all of our speakers, Mona Ghobashy, Nathan Brown, Amara Adly, Yasmine Rashidi, Hisham Hellyer. Thank you very much for being with us today. I also want to thank our program coordinator, Madison Andrews, for putting together this program, and hope to see you all soon. Thanks, everyone, for being with us.
Thank you.